Most of the time when we're exploring a new idea, here's our idea. We are working in the realm of assumptions. It's a faith-based venture. It's a religious vehicle. We believe in something. We hope that's something. And if it's something that is really original and something that we've never pursued before, we don't really know all of the answers. And our job is, as quickly as possible, is to move from assumptions to facts, from faith-based to experience-based, from we believe and we hope to data-driven knowledge that allows us to make great decisions rather than gut feeling. Now, I still believe there is a space for gut feeling, but I think the two need to come together, and the more that we can equip our leaders and managers with data that comes from really good experiments, the more likely it is we're going to pursue ideas that potentially have a much higher return, because we're dealing in data-driven decision making. Discovery-driven is another form that it's often described in. So here's what often happens. You're standing on the edge of a cliff with your idea, and you make a choice, and every idea is laden with assumptions, whether you see them or not. Idea will only work if. So here's a guy jumping off a cliff, believing that his parachute will open. This will only end well if this parachute will open. And your job is to find these leap of faith assumptions, the ones that have the biggest impact on the success of your idea. If they're wrong, the whole thing falls. There's no point in doing anything else, because once they are validated or not, then we know whether the rest of the idea is worth pursuing. Now, just like ideas, it turns out the numbers seem to suggest that around 90% of our assumptions in these bolder category ideas turn out to be wrong, to some extent at least, as well. So you need to prepare yourself. You've got to be humble with this. You cannot afford to have an ego. If you go into this with an ego saying this idea has to win, you're going to get hurt a lot. You need to start from the position of, I'm probably wrong with this. There's a lot I don't know about this. I have to enter this with a learning mindset. I have to be teachable. I have to be open to the fact that I could be wrong. And that's where it goes wrong for some people, because they can't do that. They're too in love either with their idea or the idea that they have to be right. And this is a refreshing way of helping to flush out truth in a situation to help us make better business decisions. So what are these assumptions and how do we find them? Well, these leap of faith assumptions, these big ideas, typically fall into three areas. And I'm going to borrow a model here from a company called IDEO, who really pioneered the idea of something called design thinking, which you can look up, and it sits very neatly alongside some of the ideas that we're talking about. But they very helpfully frame this in three areas. So any product or service that is going to succeed needs to be three things simultaneously. It needs to be desirable. Someone somewhere needs to want this enough. And it's not enough just to go up to someone and say, I'm thinking about building this thing, would you like it? The data that comes back from that question is so unreliable. Lots of people, if they just want you to feel happy, will just tell you yes, and then they have no intention of buying it. Or maybe they actually do believe that they would, but when they see it, that's not what they thought it was going to look like, and they don't end up buying. So is it desirable enough that it will cause me to change the way I currently solve this problem? You're asking me to switch behaviors from one way of working that I currently have to a new way of accessing the value that you're promising me through a new product or service. I've really got to want this in order to change my behavior. So one, is it desirable? And this, I find, is usually the one that trips us up the fastest. We believe, because we love the idea, we believe everybody else will. Of course they'll want this. And we can tie ourselves up in knots with that. So desirable is the first. The second is feasible. Okay, we found that quite a few people do want this, but could we actually make it even though they do want it? What's it going to take? Is it really realistic for us to retool the factory to do this, or whatever the capabilities and resources and new business model implications might be? And then thirdly, is it viable? They might really want it. We could easily build it, but actually, can we make a business out of this? Is this something that we're really going to want to dedicate a lot of time and effort to because the reward is sufficient? There's more than this in the book. There's a lot of tools that I've put in there to help you flush out a lot of the hidden assumptions that tend to hide when we're developing big new ideas. So definitely check those out if you've got the book. But your next job is to take those assumptions. Let's assume you're in a workshop setting and you've written them on post-it notes, and to plot them to understand which ones matter most, which ones are your leap of faith assumptions. So we're measuring these against the scale of the impact that this assumption could have if it turned out to be wrong or right on the success of the idea, and the level of uncertainty that you have. So you'll plot these ideas as a team, standing around a whiteboard, write them on post-it notes, and you'll have a couple up there in the top right-hand corner, which, if they're wrong, as I said just now, the whole thing falls. And they're your leap of faith assumptions. They're the major potential threats to the success of the idea. Now that gives you a starting point. It's very rough and ready, but actually it's good enough to get you started, because at this stage you're just looking for some data to validate, should we even go with this idea? So they're your leap of faith assumptions. Now, as I've said before, they do get hidden. So there's 3 questions that I like to throw into the mix to help flush out some of the more subtle, important ones that are in there. The first is, what would need to be true for this idea to succeed? Ask people to come up. It's almost like a question storm. It's an assumption storm. Ask people to list everything they can think of. Another way of phrasing it is, this will only succeed if. What might be the factors for it to be successful in, the areas of, if you wanted to, desirability, feasibility, and viability, but also think about the business model and all of the different dependencies that need to be true for that. Another way of doing it is flipping it, imagining that you've launched this thing and it failed miserably. What happened? It's called a pre-mortem instead of a post-mortem. Why did it fail? And sometimes it's actually easier to imagine the thing failing and then understand what the assumptions are than just trying to imagine them from cold. There is one more actually where you can flip this, which is, imagine this thing got a 5-star Amazon review. What would be written in those reviews? What would cause someone to be so excited about your product or service that they went onto Amazon and they wrote the review? What would that take? What would need to be true in all the different dimensions that you can think of? So at this stage, you have identified an idea, you've identified some assumptions, you've identified 1 or 2 maybe leap of faith assumptions, and now you're going to start running some experiments, not on the idea in total, but just on those assumptions, because as I've said a couple of times now, if those assumptions are wrong, the whole thing falls. We don't want to spend too much time testing the whole idea, just these things that will give us an indication as to whether we should even build this thing or not. So let's now move on and look at designing and running experiments.